The grand estate of William Hawthorne stood like a fortress of wealth, its towering gates and sprawling gardens a testament to the fortune he had built from the ground up. Inside the mansion, a storm raged not outside, but within its very walls. His daughter, Isabella, stood before him, her hands clenched into fists, her face pale with disbelief. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling between shock and defiance. William sat behind his massive oak desk, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled together in a show of unwavering authority. "I am absolutely serious," he replied. "You will marry him, and that is final." Him, a man Isabella had never met, a farmer, a nobody in her world of privilege and power. The weight of her father's decision pressed down on her like a cage. She had been raised among luxury, attending the best schools, mingling with the most influential families, and now, with one command, she was being thrown into a life she had never imagined. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Is this some kind of punishment?" William's sharp blue eyes met hers, unwavering. "It's a lesson," he said simply. "You have spent your life surrounded by excess, thinking money will always be there to save you. It's time you learn the value of a different kind of life. But a farmer, a man I don't even know, you'll learn," he said, dismissing her argument as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "And so will he." Isabella felt her world tilt. She had expected an arranged marriage at some point, perhaps to a wealthy businessman or an heir to another empire. That was how things were done in their world. But this was beyond reason. The sound of the heavy doors opening behind her made her spin around. "Your fiancé has arrived," the butler announced. Every nerve in Isabella's body tensed as she turned back to her father. His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin, steeling herself. If her father thought he could control her life this easily, he was wrong, because she wasn't going to make this easy for anyone. And neither, she suspected, would the man waiting outside. Isabella's heart pounded as she turned toward the door, bracing herself for the sight of the man her father had chosen for her. She expected someone rough, someone unpolished, a man with calloused hands and the scent of earth clinging to his clothes. But when he stepped into the room, she found herself staring in quiet surprise. Ethan Carter stood tall, his posture steady but not rigid, his deep brown eyes scanning the opulence of the mansion with quiet observation. He was dressed simply: clean jeans, a button-down shirt, and worn boots that carried the dust of the land he worked. He wasn't intimidated by the towering ceilings, the grand chandelier, or the rich carpets beneath his feet. He met William Hawthorne's gaze with a calm that suggested he wasn't here to be overpowered. Then his eyes met Isabella's. There was no admiration in his gaze, no awe for the privileged world she came from. There was only curiosity, as if he were trying to figure her out the same way she was trying to read him. William cleared his throat. "Isabella, this is Ethan Carter." "Ethan, my daughter." Ethan gave a slight nod. "Miss Hawthorne." His voice was steady, deep, with no trace of nervousness. Isabella lifted her chin. "So, you agreed to this?" Ethan didn't flinch at the edge in her tone. "I did." She narrowed her eyes. "Why?" There was a flicker of something unreadable in his expression before he answered. "Because I gave my word." William exhaled, as if satisfied with Ethan's response. "That's enough for now. The wedding will take place in a week." Isabella's head snapped toward him. "A week?" Her father's gaze hardened. "I've made my decision. You will marry him." And you will go with him to his farm. There will be no discussion. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. You can't force me. I can, William said coolly. And I will. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He simply watched as Isabella spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, her anger palpable. The week that followed was a blur of preparations, none of which Isabella participated in willingly. The wedding was a private affair, no extravagant ceremony, no media coverage, just a small, quiet exchange of vows in a setting that felt surreal. Isabella barely looked at Ethan as she said the words she had no choice but to speak. And then, just like that, she was no longer Isabella Hawthorne, daughter of one of the richest men in the city. She was Isabella Carter, the wife of a humble farmer. The drive to his farm was long and silent. Ethan focused on the road, while Isabella stared out the window, arms crossed, her thoughts a tangled mess. When they finally arrived, she took in the land stretching before her rolling fields. A modest house, a barn that had clearly seen better days. It was nothing like the grand estate she had grown up in. She turned to Ethan. So, what now? Am I supposed to milk cows? Plow fields? Ethan sighed. No one's expecting you to be a farmer, Isabella. Then what exactly do you expect? He met her gaze. I expect you to try. She scoffed, stepping out of the truck. Don't hold your breath. The first few days were unbearable. The mornings came early, with Ethan already outside working before she even opened her eyes. The air smelled of fresh earth, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves replacing the hum of city traffic. She was used to. She had no maids, no chefs, no luxury, just silence, open land, and Ethan. But he never pushed her. He never scolded her when she refused to help, never raised his voice when she complained. He simply went about his work, quietly, patiently, and somehow that infuriated her. More one evening, after another silent dinner, she finally snapped. Why aren't you angry? Why aren't you making this harder for me? Ethan looked up from his plate, expression unreadable. Because you're already making it hard for yourself. His words hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, without realizing it, Isabella began to watch him more closely. She noticed the way he treated the workers on his farm with respect, kindness, a quiet authority that had nothing to do with money or power. She saw the way he worked tirelessly, never complaining, never asking for more than what he needed. And then, one afternoon, she found herself outside, standing near the barn, watching him mend a fence. Need help? She asked, the words foreign on her tongue. Ethan looked up, surprised. Then he nodded. Sure. It was the first step, and it was only the beginning of what neither of them saw coming. Isabella hadn't planned on helping. She had only asked the question out of curiosity, maybe even out of boredom. But as she stood next to Ethan, watching him work, something unexpected happened. She wanted to understand. She wanted to see what it was about this life that made him so steady, so unshaken by things that would have broken others. She picked up a wooden plank and held it in place while he hammered the nails in. The weight of it surprised her. He made it look effortless, but it wasn't. Her arms ached from just holding it steady, and for the first time, she realized how little she had ever used her hands for anything real. Ethan noticed her struggling, and, without a word, reached out to adjust her grip. His hands, rough but warm, guided hers in a way that wasn't condescending, just patient. For a moment, their eyes met, and something in his expression softened. From that day on, something shifted. Isabella found herself waking up earlier, watching the sunrise over the fields. She started asking questions about the farm, about the crops, about the animals. She didn't realize it at first, but she was learning about the land, about effort, about resilience. And she was learning about Ethan, too. She saw the way he spoke to the farm hands with respect. The way they admired him not because he was their boss, but because he worked alongside them. He didn't just give orders, he did the work himself. There was no arrogance in him, no need to prove his importance. He simply did what needed to be done. One evening, as they sat on the porch, she turned to him. "Why did you agree to this?" He was silent for a long moment before answering. "Your father helped my family once. When we almost lost everything, he stepped in. I owed him. And when he asked me to do this, I couldn't say no." Her heart tightened. "So you did it out of obligation?" Ethan hesitated. At first, he exhaled, staring out at the land stretching before them. "But now, I don't know." The honesty in his voice unsettled her. She had spent so much time resenting this arrangement, believing it was a prison for both of them. But now, sitting beside him in the cool evening air, she wasn't so sure anymore. The real turning point came weeks later. A storm hit the farm unexpectedly, the wind tearing through the fields, the rain flooding the roads. Ethan and his workers rushed outside, fighting against the damage, trying to secure the livestock, stop the fences from collapsing. Without thinking, Isabella followed. She ran through the mud, her dress ruined, her hands covered in dirt as she helped push the feed bags to shelter. She didn't hesitate. She didn't complain. She just acted. By the time the storm passed, she was exhausted, soaked to the bone. But when Ethan looked at her, something changed in his eyes. That night, as they sat in front of the fireplace, drying off, he finally spoke. "You don't belong in a world where everything is handed to you," he said quietly. "You belong somewhere you can be more than just a name." Her throat tightened. She didn't have an answer, because for the first time in her life, she felt like she was more than just William Hawthorne's daughter. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the walls between them crumbled. Ethan started sharing more his dreams. For the farm, the struggles he had faced, the reason he never wanted anything to do with people who thought money could solve everything. And Isabella listened, truly listened. She no longer felt like an outsider. She was part of this life now. And then, just when everything felt settled, her father arrived. William Hawthorne stepped out of his sleek black car, his sharp gaze sweeping over the farm, unimpressed. Isabella saw the way he frowned at the dirt on her clothes, the tan on her skin. "It's time to come home," he said simply. Something inside her twisted. She had waited months for him to say those words, for him to realize that this was all a mistake. But now that he had, she felt nothing but dread. She glanced at Ethan, who stood still, unreadable. "I am home," she said. Her father's expression hardened. "This was never meant to be permanent. Isabella, you've proven your point. You can return now, and we can forget this ever happened." She let out a shaky breath, realization hitting her. "That was your plan, wasn't it? To teach me a lesson, to scare me into obedience." William's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Ethan didn't speak. He just watched her, waiting, and that was when she understood. This wasn't about proving anything to her father anymore. This wasn't about defiance. This was about what she wanted. Isabella straightened, meeting her father's gaze. I'm not leaving. For the first time. William Hawthorne looked genuinely surprised. Excuse me. I said I'm not leaving. She repeated, her voice steady. This isn't just some lesson for me. It's my life now. Silence stretched between them. Her father studied her for a long moment, as if searching for weakness. When he found none, his shoulders stiffened. Very well, he said, his voice cold. Do what you want. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, driving away without looking back. Isabella felt something inside her loosen, something that had been tied up in expectations and obligations her whole life. She turned to Ethan, suddenly unsure. Do you want me to stay? Ethan held her gaze, then, with quiet certainty, said, yes. And that was all she needed to hear. She stayed, not because she was forced to, not because she had no choice, but because, for the first time, she had made a choice for herself, and it was exactly where she was meant to be.